So now let's use jQuery to solve a practical problem. Back in our JS file, none of the things we've been doing so far are actually all that interesting, so I'm just going to comment them out. They were little examples, but they're not actually doing something real. What we want to be able to do is take our page, in this sidebar, we'd like to be able to show and hide it by simply clicking a button. So we can do this by, let's first create that button. So in our main, since that will always be shown, let's put the button there. So I'm going to create a quick div, and then on just an actual button, and I'll call it sidebar toggle, and I'll just say toggle menu. If we look at this in the browser, we can see we now have a little button. Looks like a button. It doesn't do anything because we haven't wired any code to it, but it gives us a starting point to actually run some code. So we go over to our site. Let's first get at the objects that we're going to be interested in. First thing I want to do is I want to get both of those panels, because I'm going to use CSS to change the way the panels look, but I first need to be able to get at them. And in our case, we're going to apply a class to both of these panels. So in the index, we can see that there is a wrapper panel and then a sidebar panel. We want to actually get both of these objects together in jQuery. We can do that using the selector syntax. So I'll say sidebar and wrapper, sidebar, comma, wrapper. That's another CSS selector syntax that says get me both of these. This ends up being an and. Get me the thing called sidebar and the thing called wrapper, and return it as what's called a wrapped set. It's a wrapped set of DOM elements. That is sort of the cornerstone of the way jQuery works. And I like conventionally in JavaScript that if I'm using jQuery, I will start the name of my object with a $sign so that I can more easily, as I read it, know that this is a jQuery object, a jQuery wrapped set in this case. And what I want to do is use the sidebar and wrapper and use a method called toggle class. Toggle class does is it will add a class if it doesn't exist or remove the class if it does exist. It eliminates our need to saying add class and remove class. It just says toggle class. And in our case, we'll say hide sidebar. It's going to be the name of that class we're going to toggle. Now that we have it toggling, we have to toggle it based on something. So let's use jQuery to go get sidebar toggle. And here I'm just going to call on, and I'm doing it directly on the return of the jQuery function, because that's often common if I'm not going to use this element more than once. Sidebar wrapper I actually need to use in a couple of places, so we got that separately. But for the sidebar toggle, we only need it once. And so that when we click this sidebar toggle, we should be toggling that add sidebar class as necessary. Let's look at this in the browser real quick. So if we refresh the page, and let's use the F12 tools, different browsers will show this in a little different way, but I'm showing you Firebug in Firefox to do this, though Chrome tools are going to be similar. I'm just going to show the sidebar and side wrapper elements in the div in the live version of that document. So if we come over here and click that toggle menu button, we'll actually see the class being added. And if we click it again, it will clear the class. Add, clear, add, clear. And this gives us the opportunity with CSS to say, oh, when hide sidebar is here, we're going to change the way both of these panels look. So let's open up that CSS page. And let's start with the sidebar. We'll say sidebar dot hide sidebar. So this is going to be a rule that's going to take effect. Let's move it up a little. When we're hiding the sidebar. So one of the things we can do is change the left. Left right now is at 0, which is the left-hand side of the page. But if I say minus 250 pixels, it should take it off the page. The reason it's 250 pixels is because that's how wide it is. Obviously, you'd want to keep these in sync. If you decide to make the width 300 later, you'd have to make the left minus 300 to hide it off the side of the page. And let's show this working. Get rid of the debug window for a minute. But if we refresh it and then click this, it'll actually disappear off the page. But of course, we aren't making what's left of the page any wider. So that's what we'll do by doing the same thing in wrapper. And here we're using a margin of 250 in order to make room for the sidebar. So here we will simply say margin left 0, when we want to hide the sidebar. So instead of having that gap for the sidebar that we put in the CSS chapter, we're going to get rid of it when that hide sidebar is there. So if we refresh it again, and as we toggle it, we'll see that it's showing and hiding exactly the way we would want to. And so this is a way of using JavaScript to get the kind of functionality we want. Well, this is working now, but I don't like that it just says toggle menu. I'd like it to actually say show and hide, and I'd like to be able to do that in that same way. Let's go ahead and do that in the JavaScript. So back in the JavaScript, if we come over here and after we toggle it, let's just do a little test. If sidebar and wrapper has class, hide sidebar. So if the toggle actually turned it on, then what we can do is say wrap the this, which is that sidebar toggle button, and let's set its text to show sidebar. And we'll go ahead and put an else in here so that when we're removing that class, we'll change its name back to hide sidebar. Now with this functionality, we're changing the look in reaction to the state of the class, not just in reaction to it being clicked. To refresh it again, and the first time we click it, it'll say show sidebar, hide, show. And we'll probably want the first state to go ahead and look at hide, but for now I'm just going to leave it the way it is because we're going to change it to an icon in a little while. But you can see that what we're doing here is we're really allowing our page to be much more dynamic. Let's make it a little more slick than it is right now. We can do that with CSS animations. So over in the CSS, I'm going to come and add a transition inside the CSS rule. And this transition is going to be when we're applying this amount, I want you to not do it all at once, but to actually animate it. So this transition, I'm going to have to tell it what property I want to transition, because there may be a lot of properties here. I'm going to transition left. I'm going to use an ease, which is going to make it slowly and then more quickly later make this change, and then I'm going to tell it how long, which in our case is going to be 0.25 seconds. Let's do the same thing for the margin left. Transition, but in this case it's going to be margin left, because that's the property. Ease and 0.25 seconds again. I want them both to be 0.25 seconds so that they move together. To go back to the browser, and when I first hide it, you can see it slide over. That's that transition. But when I show it again, it's just going to pop back into view. That's because we actually need the transition in both directions. So here in the wrapper, it'll be transition margin left, ease 0.25 seconds, and then same with the sidebar. Because both have it where the class is applied and where it's not applied, it'll know to do the right thing. As we refresh, slide out, slide back in. Slide out, slide back in. And that's a much more pleasant experience for the user. They see where it's going. It's not just disappearing on them. In their mind, it is just off the screen that they can show if they need to get information on the sidebar later. The only other thing we need to worry about, you'll notice that there's a little underline under transition in all these cases, and that's because not all the browsers support transition in the same way right now, and Visual Studio knows about this. And so as a feature is being adopted, often the browsers will implement their own versions of these rules that can be ignored someday, but that way they can test out features that may be browser specific. And so when we hover over, it'll actually say here what browsers are supporting it. It says that there are browser compatibility for vendor-specific properties, and it looks like Firefox, IE, and Opera all have their own versions of it. So if we right-click, we can say Add Vendor Specifics, and it'll go ahead and add those specific properties for us. It just makes a copy of them. And in fact, it went and found it in all of the places that were using these and applied them. And you see they're a little faded because Visual Studio wants you to know that those are copies of the main transition that it's going to try to maintain for you. So this way, when you're using browsers, if someone's using an older version of WebKit or older version of Firefox, that this will still work. The current or Edge versions all support transition now, but older versions that people may not have updated might need these vendor-specific versions for it to be a little bit more compatible. So hopefully up to this point you've seen some of the value in not only JavaScript on your page, but also using jQuery to make some of that code a little easier, more concise, and simpler to write. Let's wrap up this module.